Christmas Eve, 1969. In a narrow pastry kitchen in the northern Italian town of Treviso, a bowl of egg yolks and sugar sits on cold marble, and a soft block of mascarpone slips into it by accident. A young chef leans down and tastes the mistake. He does not throw it out. Across the same town, a woman still weak from childbirth spoons beaten egg and strong coffee into her mouth for energy, the way farm mothers had done for generations. Neither of them believes they are making history. Neither of them knows that the whole world will soon call their creation ancient. It is not ancient. It appears in no cookbook printed before that decade. No medieval recipe, no royal charter, no Renaissance court records it. It is coffee-soaked biscuits under sweet cheese, built inside living memory, and it is about to be handed a past it never had. That was 1969. But the story most people believe about tiramisu does not begin in that kitchen. It begins centuries earlier, and almost none of it is true. Siena, the end of the 17th century. The most flattering version of the legend places tiramisu in the court of Cosimo III, Grand Duke of Tuscany, as a rich spooned confection called zuppa del duca, the Duke's soup, supposedly carried north and treasured for 300 years. It is a beautiful story. It is printed on menus from London to Los Angeles. It is also unsupported by a single contemporary record. No court ledger, no household account, no dated recipe links that century to the dessert on the table today. There is a second origin story, and it is filthier. In it, tiramisu was born in a Treviso brothel, invented by the madam of the house as a strong, sweet restorative she fed to exhausted clients so they could walk home to their wives with something left in the tank. The name, this version claims, came from her promise as they left. According to legend, she told them the dessert would lift them back up. Whether any madam ever whipped mascarpone in a back room cannot be proven, and the dish as we know it depends on ingredients. No 19th century account arranges this way. What is documented is far humbler. Across the farmhouses of the Veneto, there was sbatudin, a raw egg yolk beaten hard with sugar until it turned pale and thick, sometimes loosened with a little coffee or wine. It was not a dessert. It was fuel. Mothers spooned it into sick children, into the elderly, into women who had just given birth. It carried no romance and no royalty. It was the food of people with too much work and too little meat. Tiramisu did not even invent its own architecture. Italy already owned the parts. There was zabaglione, the warm foam of yolk, sugar, and marsala that Venetian cooks had whipped for centuries. There was zuppa inglese, a layered pudding of liquor-soaked sponge and custard. There was a Turin sweet, the cookbook writer Pellegrino Artusi had recorded, dolce Torino, built from soaked biscuits and a heavy cream. The work done at Beccherie was not invention out of nothing. It was combination. Mascarpone in place of custard, espresso in place of liquor, old peasant fuel and old bourgeois pudding folded into one new thing. And that, not the Duke and not the Madam, is the real root of the most famous dessert Italy would ever export. The real ancestor wore an apron, not a crown. Beccherie, Treviso, the turn of the 1970s. The restaurant had been run by the Campiole family since 1939 in a square in the old center of the city. According to the account the restaurant has told for decades, the idea came from Alba Campiole, who remembered the zabaglione and coffee her mother-in-law had fed her to rebuild her strength after the birth of her son. She wanted to carry that homemade restorative into the dining room and make it elegant. She turned to the pastry chef, Roberto Linguinotto, known to everyone as Loli. The process they settled on used no oven and no flame. The yolks and sugar were beaten to a pale ribbon, thick enough to fall in slow folds from the whisk. Cold mascarpone was folded in by hand, gently, so the air already whipped into the eggs would survive. Savoiardi, the dry ladyfinger biscuits, were dipped in cooled espresso for a moment only, long enough to soften, but not to collapse. Then the layers went down, biscuit and cream and biscuit again, and the top was dusted with unsweetened cocoa. The whole thing was chilled, never cooked. It was assembly, not baking. They did not know the words emulsion or aeration. They were doing both anyway. And when the dish went onto the menu in 1972, it was written in the Treviso dialect as Tiramisu, which means, pull me up. A house dessert had just been given a name. Names travel. And this one traveled at a speed no genuine folk tradition ever manages. The earliest printed recipes appear only at the start of the 1980s, in the work of the food writer Giuseppe Maffioli in 1981, and in Giovanni Capnist's cookbook of Veneto sweets in 1983. The word itself entered the Italian dictionary with a first recorded date of 1980. Merriam-Webster logs its arrival in English in 1982. Within a single decade, the dish jumped from one restaurant in one provincial city to trattorias across Italy, and from there to the Italian restaurants of New York, London, and Tokyo. This was not a slow tradition passed hand to hand across centuries. It was a hit. The faster it spread, the older people assumed it had to be. And here the myths did their real work. Think about that for a second. A dessert that turns up on every serious Italian menu feels like it must be heritage, must be old, must come with a story reaching back past anyone alive. So the grand stories attach themselves after the fact. The Duke, the brothel, the vague gesture toward a renaissance that never made it. This is the part that should make you suspicious. The pattern is textbook. A recent invention succeeds, and a fictional ancient pedigree grows over it like ivy, because antiquity sells, and because diners want to feel they are eating history rather than a 1970s experiment. This was not heritage. It was marketing. The historians who later chased the paper trail, most notably the food writers Clara and Gigi Padovani, found nothing at all before the 1960s. The decision to call it ancient seemed small at the time. It was not. It set the terms of a fight that has not ended. Two people stand at the center of the honest version. The first is Alba Campule. Her motive was not fame or money. It was memory and care. The wish to take the humble strength food of a new mother and dress it for a restaurant table. Picture her at the pass, tasting, sending it back, tasting again, until the balance of bitter coffee, sweet cream, and dark cocoa was exactly right. She and her husband Ado kept Le Beccherie running for decades. The family finally closed it in 2014. Ado died in 2021 at the age of 93. Alba died a few weeks after him, at 92, the two of them leaving within a single season. The second is Roberto Linguanotto, the pastry chef whose hands actually built the thing. The most repeated version says the whole dessert began with his accident, the block of mascarpone dropped into eggs and sugar, the surprise taste, the refusal to waste it. Accounts differ on the exact gesture, and the restaurant's own telling credits Alba and Loli together, rather than either alone. Whether every detail of the accident is accurate remains debated, but the result is beyond dispute. The dish appeared on their menu, under that name, in 1972, and decades later, the Italian Academy of Cuisine formally deposited their version as the reference recipe of Treviso. Their claim was written down. Others were already writing their own. Histories this recent are rarely told honestly, because the marketing is more flattering than the facts. If you value investigations that separate the tradition from the sales pitch, subscribe before the next one. Because no one filed a patent and no one photographed the first bowl, tiramisu had a fatal gap at its heart. The earliest hard evidence, the menu, dates to 1972. The claimed moment of creation sits 3 years earlier, in an unrecorded 1969. 3 years. 3 years of silence, into which anyone with a plausible story could step. And as the dessert grew from a local sweet into a global name attached to real money, plenty of people did. The wound was reopened from an unexpected direction. In 2007, an American reporter, Jane Black, published a piece in the Washington Post under the title The Trail of Tiramisu, building on earlier reporting by the food writer David Rosengarten. At its center was a man named Carminantonio Iannaccone, a baker from the Treviso region who had emigrated to the United States and was running an ordinary bakery outside Baltimore. His claim was blunt. He said he had invented the tiramisu that Beccherie sold, that he had made it in his own bakery and delivered it to the restaurant, and that the famous kitchen had taken the credit for his work. And here is the detail that should make you sit up. And no, that is not something anyone made up. The date he named for his creation was the same date the Campio legend names: Christmas Eve, 1969. Christmas Eve, 1969. Two rival origin stories, hundreds of kilometers and one ocean apart, both planted on the same winter night. Iannaccone did not tell his story from a position of strength. He told it from behind the counter of a bakery in suburban Maryland. An old man watching a dessert he believed he had built become world famous under other names in another country. He had no menu from 1969 to hold up. Neither did anyone else. That was the entire problem. The people who make food rarely stop to notarize the moment they make it, and by the time tiramisu was worth claiming, the single piece of paper that could have ended the argument had never been written. And you have to understand what was at stake to see why the fight turned so bitter. By the time Iannaccone spoke, tiramisu was not a Treviso curiosity. It was on menus in dozens of countries, and it was a genuine commercial asset. And to be named its inventor was to be named the parent of one of the most recognized words Italy had ever sent abroad. Then came a second front, and this one was regional rather than personal. In their meticulously researched book of 2016, Clara and Gigi Padovani argued that the true birthplace was not the Veneto at all, but neighboring Friuli Venezia Giulia. They pointed to the Al Vetturino restaurant in the village of Pieris, and to a chef named Mario Cosolo, who served a spoon dessert around 1950 that carried the name tiramisu, and they traced references to a similar sweet in the region going back further still. Their conclusion was careful and provocative at once. Tiramisu, they said, was technically born in Friuli and made famous by the Veneto. So now, there were three stories, each with real evidence and real believers. A restaurant kitchen in Treviso, a baker's oven that ended up in Baltimore, a coastal village in Friuli, and even three understates the mess. Within Treviso alone, other restaurants raised their hands, among them El Tula and Del Camin, each with its own cook, its own date, and its own certainty about being first. By some counts, at least 6 establishments across the two regions have declared themselves the true birthplace of tiramisu. Every one of them believes it completely. Almost none of them can prove it. A dessert with no father had suddenly grown a crowd of them. This was not simply a disagreement between cooks. It was a disagreement between cooks made bitter by fame and money. It built reputations. It started feuds. It crossed an ocean. And it was never really a search for the truth. It was a fight over a name that had become worth a fortune. The consequences rippled far beyond a single restaurant. On the 29th of July, 2017, the Italian Ministry of Agriculture entered tiramisu onto the official list of traditional agri-food products of the region of Friuli Venezia Giulia. A spoon dessert had become a matter of state, stamped and protected by a government ministry. The president of the Veneto region, Luca Zaia, rejected the ruling in public and refused to concede an inch, insisting that Treviso was the birthplace and would remain so. Here is the sentence worth repeating at dinner. A bowl of soaked biscuits and whipped cheese became a legal designation that 2 Italian regions took to their governments to fight over. But here is the strange and unexpected part of this story. The fighting did not shrink tiramisu. It multiplied it. Every region that claimed the dessert advertised the dessert. Every newspaper article about the dispute was one more free advertisement carrying the name into another kitchen. The very thing that should have weakened it, the absence of a single provable origin, turned every rival into a promoter. Because a dish everyone wants to own is a dish everyone keeps talking about. A patent would have quieted the story. The lack of one made it immortal. Japan surrendered first and hardest. Italian food swept the country during the bubble years of the late 1980s, when money was loose and foreign fashion was currency, and around 1990, tiramisu became a national obsession. It was so sudden and so total that in Japan, it is remembered as the first of the explosive dessert booms, the very template against which every later craze, from crème brûlée to panna cotta to bubble tea, would be measured. Cafes could not keep it in the case. Magazines put it on their covers. The name entered everyday Japanese speech in its own katakana spelling, and decades later, Tokyo still has shops in Harajuku that sell almost nothing else, stacking paper cups of it in flavors from classic cocoa to matcha and strawberry. The United States took it up along a different path. Tiramisu arrived first in the ambitious Italian restaurants of New York in the 1980s, a marker of sophistication for diners who could pronounce mascarpone. Food historians of the period noted that it was fashionable in the highest-end kitchens even before the market crash of 1987, and only afterward, when Americans wanted comfort on a plate, did it spread nationwide. Then it descended, as hits always do, into casual chains and refrigerated supermarket tubs, its raw eggs quietly swapped for whipped cream, and its mascarpone sometimes traded for ordinary cream cheese. By the 1990s, the most Italian of desserts was also, thoroughly, an American one. Then the form itself began to dissolve into variation. Cooks in Asia replaced the cocoa with matcha. Others reached for strawberry, for lemon, for limoncello, for spiced biscuit spread. The espresso became something else. The biscuits became sponge or cake. The cheese sometimes vanished entirely. What survived every substitution was not an ingredient at all. It was a shape: soak, layer, dust, chill. The recipe turned out to be a template that could carry almost any flavor a local market wanted. And then it came home. In Treviso, the very city at the heart of the ownership fight, the dispute was turned into a business. A Tiramisu World Cup now draws thousands of competitors and spectators to the region, amateurs and professionals from dozens of countries, arriving to build the best version of the dessert, whose birth no one can agree on. The city that could not prove it invented tiramisu learned to profit from the argument itself. The feud became a festival. The uncertainty became a brand. The argument became a tourist attraction, printed on banners in the same streets where the Campiel family once ran a restaurant that has since closed its doors. Today, tiramisu is casually ranked among the most recognized Italian words on earth, spoken by people who will never see Treviso and could not place Friuli on a map. It has its own day on the calendar, celebrated by cooks who compete to build the best one. It sits in the dessert case of nearly every Italian restaurant in every city that has one, a fixture so total that most diners assume it has always been there. It has been on menus for roughly 60 years. Roughly 60 years. That is younger than the grandparents of the people ordering it, younger than the highways their cars drive on, younger than the myth printed on the menu beside it. But tiramisu is far more than a dessert now, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. The so-called ancient tradition has become, in plain legal terms, property. The Italian Academy of Cuisine notarized a reference recipe. A regional government trademarked the category. And when Beccherie itself closed its doors in 2014, its name did not die with it. The brand was acquired by investors from the fashion and lifestyle world, to be developed and sold, the birthplace of the dessert reborn as an asset on a balance sheet. The tradition, it turned out, could be bought. It began as a peasant's fuel. It became a restaurant's experiment. It became a nation's pride. Then a reporter's investigation. Then a courtroom of regions. Then a brand with owners. A raw yolk beaten with sugar in a cold farmhouse became a legal object worth fighting two governments over. Not bad for coffee-soaked biscuits under sweet cheese. So tell us which story you believe. Drop a comment and name your side. The kitchen in Treviso, the baker's oven that sailed to Baltimore, or the coastal village in Friuli that a government finally chose.